War has many weapons. Some are loud. Steel tracks grinding through mud, engines roaring, shells screaming through the sky. But some are silent. In 1944, as Europe bled and armies shattered cities, the United States deployed a unit that did not fire rifles or command tanks. They carried paintbrushes. They carried rubber. They carried imagination. Their battlefield was deception. The men who arrived in France were not ordinary soldiers. They were artists, set designers, sound engineers, fashion students, men pulled from places like Yale, Pratt, and Hollywood. In a war dominated by firepower, these men were told to win by lying to the enemy's eyes. They created fake armies, fake divisions, fake wars, with inflatable tanks that looked real from the air, with recorded sounds of armored convoys echoing through forests at night, with radio networks broadcasting messages of divisions that did not exist. The Nazis believed what they saw, and thousands of Allied lives were saved because of what wasn't real. This is the story of the Ghost Army, the unit that fought Hitler with illusion. War transforms everything it touches: people, cities, generations. By 1943, the world had reached a point where innovation no longer meant advancement. It meant survival. Hitler's armies stretched from the Atlantic to the gates of Stalingrad. The Third Reich controlled most of Europe, and every day, thousands of Allied soldiers died trying to push them back. In the chaos of strategy and counter-strategy, the Allies discovered a brutal truth. The side that controlled perception controlled the battlefield. The Germans excelled at this. They used decoy airfields, fake aircraft, and dummy installations to mislead Allied bombers, and they were willing to hide entire armored divisions just to ambush the enemy. The Allies needed an answer, not a bigger army, not more firepower. They needed deception. Inside the War Department in Washington, D.C., a classified project began to form, one so strange that generals whispered about it with equal parts curiosity and disbelief. Instead of recruiting soldiers, they began recruiting artists. Instead of looking through military records, they visited universities, art schools, and advertising agencies. The U.S. Army called it the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, but history would remember them as the Ghost Army. They were unlike any unit ever created. There were no strict formations, no orthodox military discipline, no standard war mentality. Many of them were barely trained in combat. They were trained to create the illusion of combat. They studied perspective drawing, camouflage, psychological warfare, the science of misdirection. Their goal was not to kill Germans, but to convince Germans that an entire U.S. division could appear or disappear. Overnight, inflatable tanks, rubber aircraft, stage prop artillery, the kind used in Hollywood films, would become their tools. To a pilot flying at 10,000 feet, a rubber Sherman tank looked identical to a real one. But deception alone was not enough. Vehicles needed to move. Armored divisions needed to sound alive. Radios needed to speak the language of war, so the unit expanded. The Ghost Army added professional sound engineers who recorded engines and troop, movements radio specialists who could mimic entire communication, networks painters who could redesign jeeps to look like command vehicles actors, men who could pretend to be officers from divisions that didn't exist. These weren't young dreamers. They were the rising artistic minds of a generation, and many would become legendary after the war. One was Art Kane, the photographer who later captured the most iconic jazz portrait in history, A Great Day in Harlem. Another was Ellsworth Kelly, who went on to become a world-renowned painter. They had futures, they had talent, and now they had orders. While infantry units marched toward the front lines to face German artillery, these men spent their nights sewing fake division patches onto their uniforms, rehearsing false military conversations at French cafes, and learning how to lie convincingly, not to civilians, but to enemy intelligence. Their mission was simple in words, impossible in execution. Make the Germans believe what wasn't real. They trained on American soil, using a classified budget that required no accountability. Inflatable tanks were tested in open fields. Sound engineers experimented with massive speakers capable of projecting audio for more than 20 miles. A convoy of trucks was transformed into a mobile sound studio, complete with recordings of tank battalions, engine starts, grinding tracks, and even idle chatter of soldiers. If a single German reconnaissance aircraft spotted the unit, everything, every illusion, had to hold up under scrutiny. After 6 months of preparation, they sailed for Europe. Their arrival was quiet. No ceremony, no fanfare. They disembarked in Normandy shortly after D-Day, while the beaches were still scattered with wreckage and the air carried the metallic odor of spent shells and smoke. Soldiers passing by confused them for a film crew, and in many ways, they were. But instead of making movies, they were now creating illusions that would shape the course of the war. The Ghost Army was ready. Their enemy wasn't just the Wehrmacht. It was the German belief in what they thought they saw. Europe in 1944 was a battlefield of shifting lines and desperate decisions. The Allies had landed in Normandy, but the war was far from won. Every mile gained came with a cost measured in blood. German forces counterattacked with terrifying precision, still believing they could force a stalemate and negotiate peace on their terms. To break through German defenses, U.S. commanders needed mobility, divisions that could move fast, strike suddenly, and keep the enemy confused about where the next attack would fall. This was where the Ghost Army would first find its purpose. Their debut was small. In a quiet French village not far from the front, the unit unpacked equipment that looked ridiculous. Rolled-up rubber tanks, inflatable artillery, fake command posts, and painted canvas that could turn a meadow into what appeared to be a fortified base. Everything was light enough to be carried by hand, because war, for them, meant creating an army by sunrise and vanishing by nightfall. They knew they weren't going to shoot back if things went wrong. If they were discovered, if a German patrol spotted them, they would die with no means to defend themselves. But the mission required belief. The illusion had to be so convincing that German reconnaissance would report it as real, and that German commanders would respond by diverting troops to counter a threat that didn't exist. To create this illusion, the unit operated like a traveling performance. Painters blended inflatable vehicles into the landscape. Sound engineers positioned massive speakers hidden in hedgerows. Radio operators began sending fake military traffic, copying the communication style of real armored divisions. And then, they waited. From the air, the German Luftwaffe spotted the new U.S. armored presence and recorded the intelligence. The deception worked. The enemy reacted exactly as planned. They shifted their artillery, moved reinforcements away from the real Allied units, and delayed their offensive. All because of an army made of rubber and sound. Over the next weeks, the Ghost Army grew bolder. They perfected the elements of deception. Visual deception. Inflatable tanks and artillery set up with meticulous attention to shadow, track marks, and personnel movement. Sonic deception. Recordings of engines, heavy machinery, and marching soldiers blasted into the night, echoing 5 to 20 miles. Radio deception. Expert operators mimicked the speech patterns, personality quirks, and message formats of real radio officers from other divisions. Each deception was a performance. And like all performances, timing mattered. Sometimes the unit operated only a few miles from German artillery. A single shell could shred the illusion, and them with it. There was no glamour to this work. The artists slept in muddy fields, not studios. Their fingers, trained for brushes and pencils, now shook as they unfolded rubber tanks in the dark, praying that German spotters didn't notice the lack of exhaust fumes. And yet, with every operation, their confidence grew. By the end of summer 1944, the Ghost Army had misled German intelligence dozens of times, helping Allied divisions leap forward while the enemy chased ghosts. But deception alone doesn't win wars. It buys time. It creates openings. By September, the Allies reached the borders of Germany. Victory finally seemed within reach. Then came the unexpected, a brutal counteroffensive, one that would become the last major German attack in the West. The Battle of the Bulge. The Ghost Army was no longer performing small tricks along the edges of the front. They were now asked to do the impossible, make the Germans believe that a non-existent U.S. armored division stood ready to defend a critical crossing, while the real division secretly moved elsewhere. The enemy had become desperate, the stakes had become fatal, and the Ghost Army, the unit armed only with rubber and illusion, was being pushed toward the most dangerous deception they had ever. Attempted war is usually measured in firepower, in the number of tanks, guns, and soldiers a commander can send into a fight. But sometimes war is measured in perception, in what the enemy believes you have. By late 1944, the Ghost Army had become masters at manipulating that belief. Everything depended on illusion, not a partial illusion, not a suggestion, a total, convincing reality. One designed to fool trained German observers who studied every shadow, every tire track, every movement along the battlefield. Their operations required more than talent. They required understanding the psychology of war, where a real armored division moved with noise, dust, chatter, and command presence. The Ghost Army had to fabricate these details with precision. Every deception started with a single question. If we were a real division, what would this look like? And then, layer by layer, they built that answer into reality. Rubber tanks were placed first, their shapes taking form as air pumps hummed quietly under camouflage netting. The inflatable Shermans looked absurd up close, soft sides, hollow frames. But from the air, from a mile away, from a reconnaissance photograph, they looked exactly like the armor that had crushed German defenses across France. Once the tanks were positioned, the painters stepped forward. Track marks were carved into the mud with shovels. Fuel cans and ration crates were scattered around as props. Engineers inverted the camouflage principle. Instead of hiding, they created visibility. A real armored division wanted to be seen. Then came the sound. Giant speakers, mounted in the backs of trucks, were pointed toward the German lines. Sound engineers rolled thick reels of wire from amplifier to amplifier, like stagehands preparing for a concert. They tested recordings of tank engines, clanking treads, shouted commands. The audio wasn't random. It was choreographed. The difference between authentic and suspicious was rhythm. Real armored divisions didn't make noise continuously. They moved, paused, repositioned. So the engineers mimicked movement by changing audio sequences every 45 minutes, creating the illusion that tanks were rolling through forests and staging along riverbanks. And all the while, the radio operators worked on the invisible battlefield, the electromagnetic landscape. They monitored the radio signatures of real divisions, studying how officers communicated. Some spoke quickly, some were terse, some preferred abbreviations that sounded like code words. Radio deception wasn't just about transmitting messages, it was about imitating personalities. When a real armored division moved away from the front, the Ghost Army copied their radio traffic exactly, down to the speech patterns and mistakes of individual operators. German intelligence, listening from across the lines, intercepted the transmissions and recorded what they believed to be the movement of Allied armor. Not a single bullet had been fired, and yet entire German battalions repositioned because of what they heard. The success of these illusions depended on proximity to danger. They had to operate close enough to the enemy that radio intercepts would seem credible, close enough that aircraft could photograph their fake armor, close enough that German scouts could see what looked like unit activity, which meant this. If the deception worked, the Germans were just far enough away to be fooled. If it didn't, the Ghost Army would be the first to die. They were not heavily armed. They carried rifles for self-defense, but they were artists, not infantry. The danger became starkly real during one operation near the Moselle River. At dawn, German patrols began scouting the tree line near their inflatable tanks. The men froze. They could not risk revealing movement. If the Germans realized the tanks were rubber, if they discovered the deception, the entire unit could be wiped out before they had a chance to explain who they were. The patrol moved within 400 yards. The Ghost Army held their breath. Then came a moment that would be retold for decades. A sound engineer, thinking fast, switched on a recording, not of tanks, but of engineers shouting orders, moving equipment, preparing defensive positions. The noise echoed through the forest like a formation of real troops getting ready for battle. The German patrol hesitated. They withdrew. To the Ghost Army, it was just a reel of sound. To the enemy, it was proof of strength. They weren't just deceiving German intelligence. They were manipulating instinct, the instinct to avoid a fight they believed they couldn't win. The unit moved constantly, sometimes staging as many as 4 fake divisions in a single week. Their trucks were worn, uniforms stained from rain and dirt. They rotated patches on their sleeves. Today the 2nd Armored Division, tomorrow the 6th, after that the 75th Infantry. Every patch was a lie. In cafes and bars near the front, Ghost Army members posed as officers, speaking loudly about upcoming attacks, knowing German spies might be listening. Their weapons were words. Their battlefield was imagination. There were nights when the rain wouldn't stop, when the mud swallowed their boots, when exhaustion dulled their senses and made mistakes feel inevitable. They could not afford a single mistake, because somewhere across the darkness, a German observer watched through binoculars. The Ghost Army existed on the razor's edge between discovery and success, and that edge was about to sharpen. Their next deception would not mislead a patrol. It would not fool a reconnaissance aircraft. It would determine the movement of an entire German panzer corps. The deeper winter pushed into Europe, the sharper the stakes became. The Ghost Army was no longer assisting the war from the edges. They were now shaping the battlefield. December 1944. Snow, wind, darkness, and the low hum of engines hidden under white camouflage. It was the coldest winter Europe had seen in decades. Soldiers described it as a season where the air felt like broken glass. The Ardennes forest, normally a place of quiet, became a frozen labyrinth of movement and fear. This was the moment Hitler launched his final gamble, the counterattack that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. Germany threw everything into it. Panzer divisions hidden by fog, assault troops wearing American uniforms, a surprise offensive intended to split the Allied front in two. Chaos spread through the line. Communication broke down. Entire divisions were suddenly cut off. In this confusion, the Ghost Army received their most dangerous assignment. They were ordered to replace a real U.S. division that was urgently needed on the opposite side of the front. Their job was to make it appear that the division was still present, entrenched, reinforced, ready to meet the German attack. The real armored division rolled away into the night. The Ghost Army rolled in. There was no margin for error. If the Germans detected the deception, if they realized that the powerful armored unit was gone, they would strike straight toward the vulnerable gap, and thousands of Allied soldiers would be overrun. They arrived in darkness. Painted canvas became headquarters. Inflatable tanks were dragged into position across frozen fields. Generators choked to life, their exhaust captured and dispersed to mimic real engine heat. Sound trucks were hidden under trees. Speakers were angled toward hillsides, allowing the wind to carry the illusion. And in the middle of that frozen night, the forests came alive. Tank treads grinding, engines starting, officers shouting orders. The Germans heard everything. From their listening posts, radio intercept units monitored transmissions. They heard messages routed through multiple channels, exactly as a large armored division would operate during emergency repositioning. The Ghost Army men had spent days studying the syntax, tone, and imperfections of real radio traffic. A single wrong word would reveal everything. Yet the operators transmitted confidently, adjusting details as weather changed, as wind shifted. As German monitors probed, the deception held. But on the ground, danger crept closer. German scouts moved through the tree line, searching for weaknesses. Snow muffled sound, making their approach nearly silent. The Ghost Army had no heavy weapons to defend themselves. Their rifles were a formality, not a solution. At any moment, the Germans could discover the truth by simply walking up and touching a tank. The engineers stayed perfectly still. Meanwhile, inside a small farmhouse that had become a temporary headquarters, a young soldier sat at a desk covered with maps. He wasn't planning troop movements. He was designing fake paperwork, orders, reports, drawings, all in case German hands ever captured the site. If a patrol broke through, even the desks had to tell the same lie. Days passed. Nerves stretched thin. Cold seeped into every joint. Sleep came only in fragments. The Germans monitored. They hesitated. Their intelligence confirmed an armored division was still in place. They redirected troop movements elsewhere to avoid a confrontation. They weren't prepared for a full German attack, one that would have smashed through the weakened line. Never came. The deception worked. In the aftermath, American commanders didn't hold ceremonies. There were no medals for illusion. But quietly, in handwritten reports filed away in military archives, a general wrote, "They saved lives. We could not have held without them." This was the moment when the Ghost Army understood their identity, not just as deceivers, but as protectors. Men who were never meant to kill, yet who saved thousands. They worked in the shadows, leaving no trace of the real division that had vanished into the fog. And then, just as quickly as they arrived, they packed up the rubber tanks, rolled the canvas, shut down the radios, and slipped away into the night. The Germans never knew they were gone. The battlefield moved. The war continued, but the Ghost Army was changed. They had always known the importance of deception. Now they understood the weight of responsibility, that their illusions were not tricks. They were shields. And soon, they would be called to perform their most daring deception yet. A final operation on the Rhine River that would help decide the end of the war. The Rhine. A barrier of water, wide and cold, stretching from the Swiss Alps to the North Sea. For centuries, armies had looked at this river and understood one truth: whoever crosses first controls the future. By March 1945, the Allies were closing in on Germany from every direction. The war was collapsing, but the German High Command still clung to the hope that the Rhine could be their final defensive wall, a line that would stall the Allied advance and buy time to negotiate peace. The Allies crossed the river in force. The war in Europe would end. But there was a problem. German forces believed the Americans would attack near Dusseldorf and Cologne, major crossings. If the Germans concentrated artillery and panzer divisions there, any real crossing attempt would end in catastrophic losses. So U.S. commanders turned once more to the men who could reshape reality, the Ghost Army. They were ordered to create the image of an entire armored division, the 30th Infantry Division, preparing to cross the Rhine at a strategically worthless location near the town of Wesel. In reality, the crossing would happen miles away. If they failed, the Germans would guess the real point of attack and unleash thousands of shells on the engineers preparing the actual bridge. This was deception on a level they had never attempted. A fake crossing site, a fake command presence, a fake army of thousands. Their tools? Air pumps, speakers, paint, nerves of steel. The mission began with silence. Under cover of darkness, trucks crept down farm roads, their headlights blacked out. Men unloaded bundles of cloth and rubber, stacking them like rolled carpets. The wind was sharp and icy. The mud sucked at their boots. They moved without speaking. Every noise had to be deliberate. In the early hours of the morning, inflatable tanks took shape again, silhouettes forming against the riverbank. By first light, the Ghost Army had created the buildup of a major force. Artillery positions, command posts, trucks lined up as if waiting for bridge access. But illusion in daylight was not enough. They needed night activity, the constant buzz of preparation, the noise of work, because real bridge crews don't operate quietly. So the sound engineers built something extraordinary. They set speakers on rotating platforms, allowing them to move sound across the battlefield. The units played recordings of construction crews hammering, cranes lifting bridge sections, troops shouting into the wind. The noise carried down the river. To German ears, listening in bunkers on the opposite side, the sounds were unmistakable. The Americans were preparing to cross. Meanwhile, the radio operators conducted the most dangerous part of the operation, impersonating the entire 30th Infantry Division. They transmitted conversations between imaginary officers, giving the impression of stress and urgency. They sent requests for ammunition, fuel, food, an army's logistical heartbeat. German intelligence intercepted every word, and it convinced them. The Germans shifted artillery away from the real crossing point. Panzer units repositioned. Their response was so precise that U.S. intelligence later confirmed. The Ghost Army controlled enemy movement. But the danger was growing. German patrols began probing the riverbank, looking for weaknesses. One patrol discovered tire tracks leading to the inflatable artillery positions. Footprints in the mud, too light for crews manning real guns, led dangerously close to the deception. The Ghost Army soldiers froze in position as the enemy moved closer. At any moment, they could fire flares, revealing everything. One private later admitted, "I wasn't scared of dying. I was scared of being discovered holding a rubber tank." The patrol paused, studying the area. And then, it happened. An order echoed across the river, a German officer demanding a flare. The night burst into harsh white light. Shadows twisted. Tank shapes appeared. A line of artillery stood ready. To the German patrol, the scene confirmed what their intelligence had already believed. They withdrew. The deception held. Hours later, at a crossing point miles away, real American engineers began constructing the bridge that would carry Patton's army across the Rhine. Not one German shell fell on their work site. The Ghost Army absorbed the danger. They carried the attention. They held the illusion, and because of them, the real crossing succeeded. The Rhine, Germany's last natural defense, was breached. The war's fate shifted. The end was coming. Morning broke gray over the Rhine. Mist clung to the water like a shroud, drifting through dead trees along the bank. The world looked quiet, but it was the silence of a held breath. The Ghost Army had spent the night powering a lie. Now, they had to survive it. Their radios continued broadcasting urgent communications from the 30th Infantry Division. The operators' voices were steady, but their hands were cold and trembling. One slip, a wrong code word, a mismatched transmission, and German intelligence would realize they were listening to ghosts. The Germans did what the Ghost Army hoped they would. They listened. Across the river, binoculars scanned the American shoreline. Artillery commanders watched for signs of movement. Panzer units waited for orders to counterattack. Once the Americans attempted to cross, everything was pointed at the wrong place. The real crossing was happening elsewhere, far south, where American engineers were building a pontoon bridge under actual fire. Here, at the fake crossing, the Ghost Army continued to play their deadly theater. They rotated vehicles, moved inflatable artillery, left fresh tire tracks around fake tank positions. Painters touched up scuffed canvas seams. A team of sound engineers adjusted their recordings because wind direction had shifted, making the fake construction noises too faint. Details mattered. A real army left waste. A real army left footprints. A real army caused chaos, so they scattered ration cans in the mud. They burned oily rags near the water to mimic the smell of machinery. They dragged chains across metal plates to simulate cranes lifting heavy bridge sections. Every sense, sight, sound, smell, was engaged. The Germans continued watching. Hours passed. The Ghost Army worked. Then, just before dusk, explosions thundered along the river. Flashes in the distance where the real pontoon bridge now stretched across the Rhine. Patton's armor began rolling into Germany, steel and fire breaking the last natural barrier of Hitler's empire. The Ghost Army couldn't celebrate. They were still exposed. Just after nightfall, German artillery began to bombard the fake American position. The shells weren't accurate. The Germans were firing based on reconnaissance, hoping to delay a crossing that was never coming. The first shell landed close. Men dove into shallow trenches they had dug only for camouflage, never expecting to use them. Artillery shredded the riverbank. Inflatable tanks ripped apart under shrapnel. Canvas airframes collapsed into crumpled shapes. One soldier crawled to a deflating Sherman and turned off the compressor to silence the hissing air. Another clamped a hand around his friend's shoulder, whispering, "Don't move. Don't make a sound." Artillery exploded in a rhythm. Fast, then slow, then fast again. I saw what German tactic meant to break concentration and catch soldiers moving between blasts, but the Ghost Army did not move. They held the lie. Minutes felt like hours. When the barrage finally stopped, one inflatable tank lay shredded, pieces fluttering in the wind like torn sails. A Ghost Army engineer crawled to it, brushing snow off the canvas. Someone muttered, "Guess we lost that tank in combat." They laughed, not because it was funny, but because laughter was all they had left to keep fear from taking over. By dawn, the artillery fire had ceased. The Germans believed the deception had succeeded in stalling the American crossing, completely unaware the real crossing had already happened. The fake division began disappearing. One by one, tanks vanished into trucks. Tracks were raked smooth. Radios went silent. Hours after they left, German scouts finally advanced, rifles ready, into the abandoned position. They found no ammunition crates, no tank ruts from heavy treads, no burned oil on the ground, just deflated fabric, scraps of rope, and silence. Too late. The Americans were already across the Rhine. The war was slipping away. The Ghost Army had completed their final illusion. Their last deception had helped accelerate the collapse of the German defense line. Within weeks, the Allies marched into Germany from multiple directions. The Third Reich began to fold like wet paper. Hitler retreated into his bunker. The artists, architects, engineers, and sound men of the 23rd Headquarters packed up their last canvas tank and headed west. Unknown, unnamed, unseen. No medals, no recognition, no fanfare. The world would not learn what they did for 50 years. But on the battlefield, stained by mud and artillery smoke, the truth was already written. Not in explosions, not in glory, but in absence. The enemy fought shadows and lost. The guns fell silent across Europe on May 8, 1945. Cities that had once echoed with artillery now pulsed with relief. Paris bursting into song, London collapsing into embraces on the streets, New York filling with confetti that drifted like snow over Times Square. Across the world, church bells rang as if they were announcing the end of darkness itself. But somewhere far from the crowds, away from the headlines and the cheering world, a small group of soldiers quietly packed their gear into duffel bags. No reporters came. No medals glimmered in their hands. No generals shook their shoulders with grateful pride, because officially, they didn't exist. The Ghost Army gathered their inflatable tanks, their miles of fake radio wire, their stacks of sketches and camouflage patterns, and loaded them into trucks like props from a traveling theater show. The war was over, but their battle wasn't finished yet. Their greatest contribution to Allied victory would be buried beneath classified ink and locked vaults. One by one, they returned home, to factories in Ohio, to small apartments in Brooklyn, to art studios with nothing but blank canvases and silence. Some of them walked into college classrooms still smelling of diesel from the sound trucks they had driven across France. Others went back to families who hugged them in the doorway, unaware their sons had once pretended to be generals, orchestrating entire divisions that never existed. And when people asked, "So what did you do during the war?" they hesitated. How do you explain to someone that you fought a war with paint, rubber, wire, and imagination? How do you describe to your parents that your weapon was deception? The world was celebrating victory, but these men were carrying a different weight, a silence that lasted not months, but decades. They had saved thousands of American lives, yet they could not talk about it. For years, the Ghost Army veterans lived ordinary lives while carrying an extraordinary secret. Bill Blass, once sketching inflatable tanks in muddy fields, would become one of America's most famous fashion designers. Ellsworth Kelly, who helped camouflage equipment and create deceptive patterns, would become a world-renowned minimalist artist. Dozens more became creative pioneers, architects, photographers, designers, shaping the post-war world in ways nobody linked to their wartime brilliance. But every now and then, at reunions or over quiet drinks, one would lean forward and whisper, "Remember the night we fooled the German recon planes? The night they fired at a rubber tank?" They would laugh, then fall silent, because even decades later, their mission was still classified. In the late 1940s, the documents that proved their existence were stamped top secret, not to be released. Their war never made it into documentaries. Their photographs never appeared in textbooks. Hollywood never told their story. They faded away like the illusions they once created. Yet history has a strange way of refusing to stay buried. Whispers of inflatable tanks began resurfacing in forgotten military archives. Curious researchers filed requests. Veterans wrote letters to Congress, asking, not for medals, but for recognition. Their legacy was too large to stay hidden forever. It would take nearly 50 years for the truth to finally emerge. And when it did, the world realized that the Allied victory had a chapter no general had ever mentioned. A chapter where art, imagination, and deception became weapons stronger than steel. By the 1990s, the story of the Ghost Army began to surface. Archives were opened, reports declassified, and slowly the world discovered what those artists and engineers had done. A secret unit of 1,100 men who had saved lives not with bullets, but with illusion, ingenuity, and courage. Historians pored over photographs. At first glance, they looked ordinary. Soldiers in muddy fields, tanks parked in neat rows. But closer inspection revealed the truth. Many tanks were inflatable, the trucks were props, and the command posts were nothing more than painted canvas stretched over wooden frames. In hindsight, the scale of their deception is staggering. During their 9 months in Europe, the Ghost Army staged more than 20 major deceptions, moving across the front lines like shadows, shaping German perception while risking their lives. Surviving members of the unit spoke of the nights they huddled under camouflage nets in freezing mud, listening to the sounds of shells landing just beyond their position. They remembered the thrill when German patrols walked right past their fake tanks, convinced the division was real. And they recalled the pride of knowing that, when real soldiers crossed a river or advanced on a town, it was safe because they had drawn the enemy's attention elsewhere. Yet the Ghost Army's greatest legacy wasn't just tactical. It was symbolic. It was proof that war isn't fought by strength alone. That intelligence, creativity, and courage can bend reality in a way that changes history. That sometimes the quietest acts of bravery, an inflated tank in a field, a radio transmission that mimicked thousands of men, a painted canvas stretched across the snow, can have the most profound impact. By the time the last veterans passed away, the Ghost Army had become more than a footnote in history. They became a symbol of ingenuity in the darkest moments. A reminder that even in the horror of war, human imagination could create hope, protect lives, and redefine what it means to fight. Today, their story inspires artists, filmmakers, and soldiers alike. Museums now display their relics. Documentaries recount their missions. And for anyone who looks closely at the maps of Europe in 1944 to 45, they will see the invisible lines the Ghost Army drew. Lines where deception saved lives and helped end a war. The Ghost Army vanished as quietly as it arrived, leaving behind no glory, no fanfare, only shadows and stories. But the echoes of their courage remain, a testament to the power of creativity, discipline, and unwavering bravery in the face of unimaginable danger. History often remembers the roar of cannons, the clash of steel, the names of generals and battles. But sometimes, the quietest contributions shape the outcome of entire wars. The Ghost Army did not fight in open fields or storm fortifications. They carried no heavy artillery. They did not seek glory. Their weapons were creativity, cunning, and courage, and their battlefield was imagination itself. Yet their impact was profound. By deceiving the enemy, they saved lives, protected units, and changed the course of engagements in Europe. Their story challenges how we define heroism. True bravery is not always about facing death head-on with a rifle. Sometimes, it is about standing frozen in mud under artillery fire, knowing that your success depends on every subtle movement, every perfectly timed sound, every illusion held perfectly in place. It is courage tempered by patience, precision, and trust in one's own skill and in the mission, even when the world may never see or acknowledge it. Decades passed before the Ghost Army received recognition. And yet perhaps that was fitting. Their work was meant to be invisible. History only glimpsed their victories indirectly. A bridge held, a division protected, a river crossed, lives spared. They remind us that the most powerful victories are sometimes those we never see. Today, as we look back at the Second World War, it is impossible to ignore their shadow on history. The Ghost Army stands as a testament to ingenuity, resilience, and the human spirit's ability to shape reality against impossible odds. They fought a war of perception, and in doing so, they taught the world a timeless lesson. Sometimes, what is unseen can be the most powerful weapon of all, and in the quiet moments of reflection, we realize that the true measure of courage is not always in the battles we witness, but in the ones that occur in the shadows for the sake of others.